Hey everybody, this is Sheets, and this is actually the second video that I'm doing on this weekend's slate because there were two major changes that occurred that I did feel as though required a new video to be done. It really shouldn't take all that long, but the first thing is that the Moda Van Camp fight was canceled, and that's a really big deal. Because Moda was an incredibly high equity play. Moda was priced as an underdog, but because Van Camp was a replacement fighter, Moda was actually about a 3-1 favorite in that fight. So Moda was essentially a mathematical lock. And he also had a very strong inside the distance prop, or at least above average, which made him a very, very strong play around which most lineups should have been focused. The other thing and that fight has been canceled. The other thing that happened of significant note is that Dakota Bush dropped out of his fight with Rong Zhu. And what that did was created a new mathematical lock in Rong Zhu, because his replacement was Jenkins, and Zhu was already priced at 7,600, so DraftKings couldn't change that. And Rong Zhu, according to the betting market, is about a 3-1 favorite. So Rong Zhu is going to replace sort of Moda as the kind of mathematical lock. But as you'll see, it does create a different type of lineup build than I had originally thought, because remember, we were struggling with how many of those above 9K guys we could use. And we found that it was kind of hard to get to the top one, the Sarukian, with Moda's price tag. But Zhu, you're actually going to be saving 300, I think, off the Moda price tag. So he's probably going to be able to get in even the highest price, the 9,500s. So what we are going to do is I'm going to go through this whole thing again and just kind of show you the, what I consider just real high equity plays. And what I think is the right approach to this slate is to really just fade almost everybody else. You know what I mean? I don't say everybody else. There's a couple of key fights that you want to target, and I think everybody else is just going to fall by the wayside as far as my builds go. So let's just review. So again, Jenkins against Zhu. Zhu is priced as a basically a 2-1, well, almost a 2-1 underdog. And according to the betting markets, as you can see, he's a 3-1 favorite plus. In addition to that, his inside the distance prop is, I would say, above average. So the combination of these things leads you to be a real strong core play. The other really strong kind of equity play that we talked about, not nearly as strong as Zhu, but pretty powerful when you also consider the style upside, is, where do you go? Harris against Kasagny. So you'll see that Harris is priced here almost like a 2-1 underdog. And if you look at his betting odds, he is just barely an underdog. I mean, like almost a pick 'em. So just on pure win equity, he's probably a really, really strong play at 7,300. But when you factor in the fact, the idea that he is really going to continue to go for takedowns after takedown after takedown, which is rewarded handsomely by the DraftKings scoring system, it creates this kind of win condition where, not only do you have win equity, but you also have just high upside point equity also. So Harris also is a very, very strong play. And while we're at it, I mean, may as well highlight, Smith against Ryan Spann. I mean, like Ryan Spann is only $1.50 underdog maybe, and he's being priced like he's a 2-1 underdog. I mean, look at this. They're pricing this main event. I mean, 9,100, 7,100. That's just a misprice. And considering that Spann has more of the finishing upside than Smith does, I feel as though Spann is extremely strong here. So depending on how funny you want to be about it, I mean, I would make sure to have at least, I mean, certainly at least one of these guys in all your lineups, maybe two and maybe three. I just feel as though the math behind these three guys is just so strong. I will say that of these three, even though Zhu has the strongest misprice, you know what I mean? Because he's over 3-1 favorite and he's being priced as a decent underdog here. I do think there's a little more variance in this matchup, only because Zhu, I remember he came over from China for his last fight, and he's it's weird. He's like 21 years old with like 100 fights, and he really looked pretty poor as a pretty decent sized favorite against Vargas coming over from China. So it's possible that his whole existence over in China is kind of a fraud. So it's very possible that he's not, that he's probably a bet against at 3-1. So while, yeah, I mean, even if you account for a little bit of variance, even if he's a 2-1 favorite in real life, still being priced as like a $1.50 underdog. So he's still a good value, but maybe not as great as maybe some people would have you believe, I guess. So between all three of these guys, I guess I rate them all. You have to consider Zhu the best, then Harris, then Spann, but all three of these are really, really strong plays. So then what you have to do is figure out, where the rest of your lineups are going to come from. And to me, with all this money that you can spend, I don't see any reason to avoid these 9K guys, and let's just go over them. You got to make sure you get the right ones, but well, Anthony Smith, I'm not particularly interested in at 9,100 anyway, so I'm not worried about that. But let's look at some of these guys. So Montel Jackson, he's a freaking 6-1 favorite, maybe 7-1, and not only that, he's got a inside the distance prop where so here's the deal. It's about he's a little bit of a favorite. Well, it's close to go under 1.5 rounds. So I would say that what they're saying is about 50%, almost 40% of the time it finishes in the first round, 40% of the time finishes the second round. I mean, they actually have prices on that. It's likely, it finishes in the first round. So fights start round 2, it's minus 205. If you want to fight won't start, you get plus. So it's favored to go to the second round, but not by that much. So he's a huge favorite. He's got the winning upside. He's got the safety, and he has finishing upside. The only thing I would say, though, he is 9,500. So if price were an issue, I would say that 9,500 is a tough price to pay. I mean, he really has to finish him in that first round. So it's not as if he's a lock to do that. I mean, he's probably he's an underdog to finish him in the first round. So if he goes to the second round, might not pay off 9,500, but you might not need to quote unquote pay off 9,500. You might not need to to save. You might not need to have him get like 12x or something like that when you have these 7K guys that are super, super strong plays. The other fight I wanted to highlight is, well, there are three more. Tony Gravely against Nate Maness. So this one it doesn't have as good of an inside the distance prop as some of the others. It's not bad. I would say kind of average, but Tony Gravely has that wrestling, grappling upside, that style that is very conducive to DraftKings scoring. So even though he doesn't have the same finishing upside, he could get plenty of points without finishing him. So Gravely certainly a very strong play at 9,100. Certainly someone to consider. This next fight, Buckley Arroyo. I mean, this is really, really strong. I mean, look at the inside the distance prop here. It's basically a pick 'em to go under 1.5 rounds. Very similar to the Montel Jackson fight. And Buckley, although he's not a 5-1 favorite, he's a 2-1 favorite, and that's pretty significant. And the only question that I'm going to have is whether I want to play any of Arroyo or Arroyo, depending on how you pronounce it. because Arroyo does try to fit it. You know, he doesn't mind mixing it up, and he does have some first round KO upside. And if this means anything to you, Buckley lost his last fight by a head kick, and Arroyo's really good with head kicks. So kind of a niche little style problem that maybe Buckley could have. But Buckley's extremely strong play given the finishing upside, the inside distance prop, and all that. So we'll get to Sarukian in a second, but Ion Kudilaba against Devin Clark. This is extremely strong play. Look at the inside the distance prop again. It's very close to the Montel Jackson, and Kudilaba is really where all of the equity comes from. Devin Clark could be sort of sneaky. Like he does have some decent wrestling, but Kudilaba is good at wrestling too. I really think this. If you're going to play this fight, you're going to play Kudilaba. And then Kudilaba is an extremely strong player, and he's another 9,100 guy. So he, someone you want to consider. And Sarukian is the interesting one, as far as I'm concerned, because so he's an 8-1 favorite, all right, like maybe 7-1 favorite. He's got a lot of hype behind him. He's fought some decent competition. He's on the upswing. He's 25 years old, whatever. You'll notice his inside the distance prop really doesn't exist because he's not really a finisher. But I don't say what he does do. What he did do specifically in his last fight was, we'll pull this up. He took his opponent down 10 times en route to 126 fantasy points. And this is the other type of fighter you want, along with KO first round guys. I mean, you want guys that not necessarily are going to finish you, but are just going to keep taking you down. Those are extremely strong DraftKings plays. The only thing I would say, though, is that 9,600 is rough business, man. I mean, like, you know, he's really got to get. I mean, look, with very little finishing upside. I mean, the inside the distance prop kind of says it all. He really needs to get like 5 takedowns to make this work. And I just have this memory of his fight with Frivola, not the fight itself, but the content leading up to that fight. Basically, the idea was that Sarukian was going to be able to do this to Frivola. I mean, so it's not as if this were particularly off the board. And I would just say that if let's just say you X this fight out, you don't really see the type of takedowns out of this guy to generate a $9,600 price tag. Now, again, okay, but he did have 10 takedowns. Yes, that's true. But what if, I mean, what if this were an outlier? You know, what if he's really just, you know, he's good, but not great? You know, you have very, very little room for error at 9,600. That's the problem. And the thing is that I was willing to fade him before, because in the previous construct, when I didn't have Ron Ju and I had Moda, it was very difficult to get Sarukian in anyway. So I made a pretty easy case to fade him. But now that he's a little easier to get in, I think that it's even a more sharper fade, because now I think he's going to get really highly owned. I think that his ownership was going to be kept in check because of his price when it was difficult to get him in. But now that they've replaced the kind of mathematical lock Moda with the mathematical lock Ju, I'm telling you that when you play some lineups, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's going to make a big difference with the ability to get him in. So the fact that he can get in that much easier means, number one, you could probably do it. And number two, he's going to be that much more popular, which makes him kind of a sharper fade. Okay. So for me, you know, you could certainly, without me going through a full lineup, but you could certainly probably play the $300 I mentioned and the 3 9K guys, or 3 of the 4 9K guys I mentioned without a problem. But I also do feel that, you know, you could fade, say, Sarukian and, you know, be in good shape over the field. Again, he needs to get a really, really big score. And it's not as if those other 9K guys are bad. I mean, they could put up 100 really, really easily. Now, the other thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention, okay, well, I want to say one other thing about the Sarukian fight, but Giagos, I mean, he surprised people in his last fight. I mean, I thought so. I mean, he was a $9,100 guy in his last fight that everybody was fading. And he came out, first round looked a little fishy, but the second round, he looked pretty good. So I don't know if Giagos is that terrible. I don't really bet these things straight up, but 5-1, I mean, he looked good enough to me. I don't know. The other thing that I would mention about this card, I mean, we can go through these other fights, but most of them are just terrible. Like Whitmire, Goldie, you'll just have to trust me. I mean, they all have just terrible inside the distance props. There's no huge grappler versus, striker upside in any of these things. So I don't think a lot of the action's going to come from there. There's a couple of spots I did want to mention. So Impa Casagne, I think, is definitely live against Carlston Harris for a KO and for a finish. So if you wanted to pivot off those 9,200 guys or whatever and play a little bit of him, I still do think he's in play at 8,800. And the other kind of fight that I mentioned here was this Rodriguez Inchuki fight. Like, if you look at the inside the distance prop, it's actually pretty close to what we need. I mean, it's about pick'em, well, almost pick'em at under 2.5 rounds, which is fine. So if you wanted to play a little Inchuki or Rodriguez to get off of the other kind of like more chalky options, I think you could do that. But unlike previous build, it's not as necessary to do that. If that makes any sense. I guess the guy that I'm going to just have to let beat me is Anthony Smith. He's the $9,100. I'm just not playing. I just think that Spann's the right side of that fight, given the price and all that stuff. And that's pretty much it, man. This is the way to make like a 15 fight slate seem pretty small, because of the combination of those kind of mispriced replacement fighter fights and these 9K guys who got very, very good finishing upside and or good wrestling upside. So I think a lot of these fights are just pure fades and are just essentially paying the rake for people to get the rest of it right. The last thing I would say about this card is, given what I've said, I feel as though you could leave some money on the table as well. And I'll let you figure that out by when you do constructions based on everything that I said in this slate preview. Okay, that's about all I have. Good luck on this weekend's card.